By sunrise the next morning, Officer Grant Holloway had convinced himself that the storm had passed. The headlines were cautious. The official statements were brief. The department had already issued a carefully worded notice promising transparency and a full review. To Grant, that sounded like protection. It always had. He sat inside the precinct conference room on the second floor, nursing a paper cup of burnt coffee while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking downtown Norfolk. The room smelled faintly of printer toner, damp uniforms, and old carpet. Around him, other officers spoke in low voices, careful not to meet his eyes for too long. Something had changed overnight. Nobody said it directly, but he could feel it. Captain Richard Boone stood near the front of the room, reviewing documents on a tablet. His jaw looked tighter than usual. Every few seconds he adjusted his glasses and checked his phone again. Grant noticed. So did everyone else. "What is going on?" one officer finally asked. Boone did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window where gray clouds rolled across the harbor like a slow-moving wall. "There are people asking questions," he said. "A lot of people." The room fell quiet. Grant leaned back in his chair and forced a laugh. Questions happen every day. Nobody laughed with him. That bothered him more than he expected. Across town, the city was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled through intersections. Ferry horns echoed across the water. Coffee shops filled with commuters escaping the drizzle. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the morning, another current was moving. Phone calls were being made. Messages were being forwarded. Names were being verified. Maya Brooks had never been the kind of person who spoke often about herself. Most people knew her as a community volunteer, a youth mentor, a woman who spent weekends helping veterans complete paperwork and connect with services they had earned. What very few people knew was how many lives she had quietly touched over the years. In a modest brick home 15 miles from downtown, retired Navy Master Chief Daniel Mercer stared at a photograph sitting on his kitchen counter. The frame was old. The corners were worn. In the picture, Maya stood between several service members during a charity event, smiling beneath a bright Virginia summer sky. Daniel's phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then again. By the fifth call, he answered. He listened without speaking. His expression hardened. When the call ended, he looked out through the rain-streaked glass above his sink and exhaled slowly. "Not Maya," he whispered. 3 states away, another phone rang. Then another. Men who had served together years earlier found themselves hearing the same name repeated again and again. Some sat in offices. Others worked construction sites. One was coaching a Little League practice. Another was helping his daughter move into a college dorm. Different lives. Different cities. The same reaction. Silence first. Then concern. Then determination. Back inside the precinct, Grant glanced toward the television mounted high on the conference room wall. A local news anchor had just interrupted regular programming with a developing update. The captain lowered his tablet. Every officer in the room turned toward the screen. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavier by the second. And for the first time since the previous afternoon, Grant Holloway felt a small, unfamiliar knot forming in his stomach. The television volume seemed louder than it should have been. Even the soft hum of the fluorescent lights faded beneath the voice of the news anchor. Captain Boone folded his arms across his chest while officers throughout the room stared at the screen. A photograph of Maya Brooks appeared beside the station logo. She looked exactly as she always had in public appearances. Calm eyes, gentle smile, the kind of face most people forgot until they needed help. The anchor spoke carefully, choosing every word with precision. New information had emerged about Maya's years of volunteer work with military families, wounded veterans, and transition programs across the East Coast. The report showed images of community events, scholarship fundraisers, and holiday gatherings. One photograph after another flashed across the screen. In nearly every image, Maya stood beside men and women who had spent their lives serving the country. Grant shifted in his chair. Something about the coverage bothered him. It felt different from the usual local story. Bigger, more focused, as if someone had opened a door that could not be closed again. Then another image appeared. This time, several decorated veterans stood shoulder to shoulder around Maya during a fundraising event held 3 years earlier. The anchor paused before continuing. According to multiple sources, support for Brooks has expanded rapidly among military communities nationwide. The room remained silent. One officer cleared his throat. Another lowered his gaze to the floor. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, cars were arriving one after another at a waterfront veterans center overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Rainwater shimmered across the parking lot beneath gray morning skies. Some arrivals wore business suits. Others stepped out in jeans, work boots, or weathered jackets carrying unit patches from years long past. They greeted one another with firm handshakes and quiet nods. No speeches, no cameras, no attention-seeking. Just people who had received a message and decided to show up. Daniel Mercer stood near the entrance holding a folder beneath his arm. He watched each arrival carefully. Many of them had not seen one another in years. Yet none had hesitated. Inside the building, coffee brewed in large steel urns while volunteers arranged folding chairs. The atmosphere felt serious but respectful. On one wall hung photographs of military service members stretching back decades. On another hung a framed quote about honor and responsibility. Daniel glanced toward the windows overlooking the harbor. "She helped every one of us in some way," he said quietly. "Now we help her." Heads nodded around the room. Nobody argued. Back at the precinct, Grant checked his phone. The knot in his stomach tightened. Notifications were multiplying faster than he could read them. Community leaders were speaking publicly. Veterans organizations were releasing statements. Former city officials were asking questions. Reporters were requesting interviews. What had seemed isolated yesterday now felt impossible to contain. Outside the station, rain rolled down the concrete steps in silver streams. A few pedestrians paused across the street, looking toward the building before continuing on. Grant stared through the glass entrance doors and felt something unfamiliar settle over him. For the first time, he realized this was no longer just an internal matter. The story had moved beyond paperwork, beyond procedures, beyond the walls of the department itself. And somewhere beyond the city limits, more people were already on their way. By late afternoon, the rain had finally stopped, but the city felt heavier than before. Low clouds still hung over the harbor, turning the water a dull shade of steel beneath the fading light. At police headquarters, the atmosphere had become almost unbearable. Every hallway conversation stopped when someone new approached. Phones rang constantly. Supervisors moved from office to office carrying folders and tablets. Nobody seemed relaxed anymore. Grant Holloway sat alone at his desk staring at a computer screen without really seeing it. The glow reflected across his face while unanswered messages stacked up one after another. Reporters wanted statements. Community organizations wanted accountability. Internal investigators wanted timelines. The pressure was no longer coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere at once. Across town, Maya Brooks remained at St. Catherine Medical Center undergoing routine observation. Her room was quiet except for the occasional beep of monitoring equipment and the distant squeak of carts moving through the hallway. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and soft golden lines across the blanket covering her legs. She looked exhausted, but calm. A nurse adjusted a pitcher of water on the bedside table before leaving. Moments later, another visitor entered. Then another. A retired teacher. A local pastor. A military spouse. None stayed long. None came seeking attention. They simply wanted to see her, to remind her she was not alone. Flowers slowly filled the room. Cards covered the windowsill. By evening, there was barely enough space left for them. Maya looked at the growing collection and shook her head softly. She had never helped people expecting anything in return. Yet somehow the kindness she had scattered across years of service seemed to be finding its way back to her all at once. Meanwhile, the gathering at the Veterans Center continued to grow. More vehicles arrived throughout the afternoon. Some carried men with silver hair and careful steps. Others carried younger veterans still active in their communities. The meeting remained peaceful, organized, respectful. Yet there was unmistakable determination in the room. Daniel Mercer stood before a large map pinned to the wall. Beside him sat community leaders, former service members, nonprofit directors, and legal advocates. They reviewed documents, witness accounts, and public records. No one raised their voice. No one spoke emotionally. The discipline in the room was almost unsettling. They were not interested in revenge. They wanted answers, real answers, and they intended to keep asking until they received them. Back at headquarters, Captain Boone stepped into Grant's office carrying a thick file. The captain looked older than he had that morning. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath the weight of the day. He placed the folder on the desk without speaking. Grant looked down at it, then back up. What is this? Boone exhaled slowly. Everything. The single word hung in the air. Grant opened the file. Inside were transcripts, reports, witness statements, and requests from multiple agencies. Far more than he expected. His mouth went dry. Outside the office window, evening settled across the city. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Headlights flowed along wet roads like streams of white and red. Somewhere beyond those streets, hundreds of people were paying attention now. Watching. Waiting. And for the first time since this began, Grant understood something that chilled him more than any investigation. The story was no longer under anyone's control. Night settled gently over Norfolk, washing the city in silver reflections and long shadows. The storm that had dominated the previous day was finally gone, leaving behind streets that glistened beneath rows of amber streetlights. At St. Catherine Medical Center, the activity in the hallways had slowed. Visitors had returned home. Phones had stopped ringing. Even the steady rhythm of the hospital seemed softer now. Maya Brooks sat alone beside the window of her room, wrapped in a light blanket. Beyond the glass, the harbor stretched into darkness. Small lights from distant boats shimmered across the water like scattered stars. She held a paper card in both hands. It was simple. No expensive design. No elaborate message. Just a handwritten note from a teenager she had mentored years earlier. Thank you for believing in me when nobody else did. Maya read the sentence again and smiled faintly. Around the room, bouquets of flowers rested on every available surface. Cards filled the shelves. Yet it was the smallest note that seemed to hold her attention. For a long moment, she simply watched the harbor and listened to the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Across town, Daniel Mercer stood alone outside the Veterans Center. Most of the vehicles were gone now. The parking lot sat nearly empty beneath the moonlight. He slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and looked toward the sky. The air smelled fresh after the rain. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the city. The sound carried through the night before fading into silence. Daniel thought about the years he had known Maya. He remembered food drives, scholarship events, hospital visits, and countless moments that never made headlines. She had shown up for people when cameras were absent and recognition was impossible. That was why so many had answered the call now. Not because she asked, because she never would. Back at headquarters, Grant Holloway remained alone in his office long after most employees had left. The building felt different at night. Without the usual noise, every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of a wall clock, the distant buzz of fluorescent lights, the faint vibration of air moving through ventilation ducts. He stared through the window, overlooking the city. Earlier, he had tried reviewing documents, then messages, then news reports. None of it helped. The same thought kept returning. He had spent years believing authority created certainty. Now certainty seemed farther away than ever. Down below, traffic moved steadily through wet intersections. Ordinary people continued their lives. Families ate dinner. Children finished homework. Friends met for coffee. The city breathed as it always had. Yet for Grant, everything felt suspended. Somewhere between what had happened and whatever came next. Near midnight, Maya rose from her chair and stepped closer to the window. The glass felt cool beneath her fingertips. The harbor lights reflected softly across her face. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. Not because she felt defeated. Not because she felt victorious. Simply because she was tired. Tired in the honest way that follows a long day. When she opened her eyes again, the water remained calm. The city remained quiet. And for the first time since everything began, there was no noise demanding attention. Only silence. Deep, steady silence. The kind that arrives before the truth finally finds its way into the light. The following morning arrived with clear skies for the first time in days. Sunlight poured across the city, reflecting from office towers and harbor water alike, turning everything brighter than it had seemed all week. At police headquarters, the atmosphere remained tense, but something subtle had changed. The uncertainty that had dominated every conversation was beginning to give way to facts. Inside a conference room on the fourth floor, investigators, department officials, and legal advisors sat around a long polished table reviewing evidence collected over the previous 48 hours. No one spoke casually. Every page mattered now. Every statement carried weight. Captain Boone stood near a projection screen displaying a timeline assembled from traffic camera footage, dispatch records, witness interviews, and public reports. As the presentation continued, details that had once appeared isolated began connecting together with uncomfortable clarity. Several witnesses who had never met one another had described the same sequence of events. Independent recordings supported portions of their accounts. Timestamps matched. Locations matched. Even small observations matched. The room grew quieter with each passing minute. Grant Holloway sat near the end of the table, his shoulders rigid. He watched the timeline unfold and felt the last pieces of certainty slipping away. For days he had focused on defending his decisions. Now he found himself confronting something different. Perspective. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It arrived slowly, like sunlight entering a dark room through a narrow opening. He remembered faces he had forgotten, conversations he had dismissed, assumptions he had never questioned. Across town, Maya Brooks was preparing to leave the hospital. A nurse handed her discharge paperwork while volunteers helped gather flowers, cards, and gifts that no longer fit inside the room. Maya laughed softly at the sight of so many bouquets being carried into boxes. The laughter surprised even her. For the first time in days, she felt lighter. Not because everything had been resolved, because she could finally see that truth no longer depended entirely on her carrying it alone. Outside the hospital entrance, a small crowd had gathered. Not reporters, not politicians, ordinary people, veterans, teachers, neighbors, parents, students she had mentored years earlier. They stood patiently beneath the morning sun, waiting simply to greet her. Some carried coffee. Others carried handwritten cards. One elderly veteran removed his cap and nodded respectfully as she emerged through the doors. Maya stopped for a moment, visibly moved. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer received a call while standing near the harbor. He listened quietly, then lowered the phone and stared out across the water. A faint smile crossed his face. The investigation was progressing faster than expected. More importantly, people were finally paying attention to the right questions. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Facts. Back inside headquarters, the final slide appeared on the conference room screen. Silence settled across the room. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody argued. The evidence spoke for itself. Grant looked toward the window where sunlight reflected across the glass. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he lowered his eyes. Not because someone forced him to. Because for the first time, he fully understood what everyone else had begun to see. The story had never been about power. It had been about a woman whose character remained stronger than the assumptions made about her. And that realization changed everything. 3 days later, the city felt different. The tension that had gripped every conversation was beginning to loosen, replaced by something quieter and far more powerful. The investigation continued through official channels, but public attention had shifted toward a different story. People were no longer talking only about what had happened. They were talking about who Maya Brooks had always been. Local newspapers published stories about scholarship funds she had helped create. Veterans shared photographs from community events stretching back more than a decade. Former students spoke about the afternoons she spent tutoring them after school when nobody else had time. One story after another painted the same picture. A woman who had spent years lifting others without asking for recognition. On a bright Saturday morning, a community gathering was organized at a waterfront park overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. White tents lined the grass. Children chased one another beneath clear blue skies. Food trucks filled the air with the scent of barbecue and fresh lemonade. American flags moved gently in the breeze. Maya almost declined the invitation. She disliked being the center of attention. But Daniel Mercer convinced her to attend. "This is not about attention," he told her. "It is about people saying thank you." When Maya arrived, applause spread through the crowd. She immediately looked embarrassed. Her hand covered her mouth for a moment as she tried to process what she was seeing. Hundreds of people had come. Veterans, teachers, nurses, families, young adults she had mentored years earlier. One by one they approached her, not with speeches, not with grand gestures, simply with gratitude. Some handed her photographs. Others shared stories she had forgotten. A young father introduced Maya to his daughter and explained that a scholarship she helped arrange years earlier had allowed him to finish college. An elderly woman hugged her and whispered that Maya had visited her every week after her husband passed away. Each conversation seemed to leave Maya more overwhelmed than the last. Meanwhile, Grant Holloway stood several yards away near the edge of the park. He had arrived quietly, hoping not to draw attention. The sunlight reflected across the water behind him, while voices and laughter drifted through the air. For several minutes, he remained where he was, uncertain whether he belonged there at all. Eventually, Daniel noticed him. Their eyes met. Daniel said nothing. He simply gave a small nod. The gesture carried no hostility. No welcome either. Just acknowledgement. Grant took a slow breath and walked forward. When he finally stood before Maya, the noise around them seemed to fade. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Grant lowered his eyes. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About more than I understood at the time." Maya studied him. The crowd around them remained respectfully silent. "I cannot change what happened," Grant continued. "But I needed to say that I understand that now." The words were simple, unpolished, honest. Maya remained silent for several seconds. Then she nodded, not because everything had been erased, not because consequences no longer mattered, but because bitterness was never the thing she carried. "I hope you learned from it," she said gently. Grant swallowed hard and nodded. "I will." The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet when it ended, something invisible seemed to lift from the air. Around them, the harbor sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Children laughed in the distance. Music drifted from a nearby speaker. And for the first time since this story began, healing felt possible. Summer arrived quietly. Weeks passed, then months, and the city gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm. The headlines faded. News trucks disappeared. Public attention moved on to other stories. Yet some things remained. On a warm evening in late July, the waterfront glowed beneath a golden sunset. The Chesapeake Bay reflected bands of orange and silver across calm water, while sailboats drifted slowly toward the horizon. Children played near the shoreline. Couples walked along the boardwalk. Music floated from a distant restaurant patio. Life continued, steady and familiar. Maya Brooks stood near the railing overlooking the harbor, holding a cup of iced tea in one hand. The breeze lifted a few strands of her hair as she watched the sun sink lower across the water. Beside her sat a small bronze plaque recently installed by local volunteers. She had protested the idea from the beginning. She never wanted recognition. In the end, the community ignored her objections. The plaque did not mention controversy. It did not mention investigations or headlines. It carried only a simple inscription: "To a woman who chose service when nobody was watching." Maya shook her head every time she read it. Yet secretly it touched her more than she admitted. A few yards away, Daniel Mercer laughed while helping a group of teenagers unload supplies for a scholarship event. The program had expanded significantly over the previous months. Donations arrived from people across the country. Veterans organizations contributed resources. Community leaders volunteered their time. What began as a local effort had become something much larger. Not because of publicity, because people wanted to continue the work Maya had started years before. As the evening lights softened, several students approached Maya to thank her personally. One young woman spoke about being the first member of her family to attend college. Another planned to enter nursing school. A young man hoped to become a teacher. Maya listened to each story carefully, the same way she always had. Never rushing, never pretending, making every person feel seen. Across town, Grant Holloway sat alone on a park bench beneath a row of oak trees. The sun filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns across the sidewalk. In his hands rested a notebook filled with pages of personal reflections written over recent months. The process had not been easy. Change rarely was. But for the first time in years, he had stopped defending every assumption and started examining them instead. He looked toward families gathering nearby and thought about how close he had come to learning nothing at all. The realization still humbled him. Back at the harbor, the last edge of sunlight slipped below the horizon. The water darkened gradually from gold to deep blue. One by one, lights appeared along the shoreline. Maya leaned against the railing and watched them emerge. Behind her, laughter echoed from the scholarship event. Ahead of her, the bay stretched peacefully into the distance. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The wind, the water, the voices of people whose lives continued moving forward. No applause, no speeches, no dramatic ending. Just the quiet sound of a community becoming a little stronger because kindness had refused to disappear. When Maya finally turned away from the harbor, the bronze plaque caught the glow of a nearby street lamp. For a brief moment, The engraved words reflected softly against the darkness. Then the evening settled around them, calm and unhurried, and the city carried on beneath a sky full of stars.